I sat in the hard plastic booth in the McDonald's near the strip mall, sipping coffee and waiting for Mr. Cromes to arrive. It all started as a paper for college. Stragview is such an iconic prison, existing for so long that it's taken on a life of its own. At this point, I guess it became a book, but the more I wrote, the more I realized that what I had wasn't very entertaining. People didn't want a technical history of Stragview. They wanted something that they couldn't get from a textbook. They wanted stories that hid in the shadows of that ancient place, and I was just the person to drag them into the light. Or so I thought. The more I wrote, the more walls I hit when getting stories from the inside. When I had lamented this lack of interesting stories to my granddad, he had given me a friend's email address from his days in corrections. Granddad had a few good stories, and I'd gotten a few other guards and ex-inmates to talk to me about their time at the place. But it seemed to be hard to get people to talk about their time at Stragview. Stragview cast a long shadow, and it appeared to be hard to stay out of the dark cast of that ancient space. That was a line from my book, which I'm pretty proud of. Stragview is a local oddity, having existed in some capacity for nearly 200 years. The exact history is hard to find. I know that it had been a prison during the Civil War, an internment camp for a while during World War II for German and Japanese citizens, and was one of the last prisons to operate an electric chair. These were things that everyone knew, though. The prison was very secretive about what went on inside, and people who left tended to be tight-lipped about their time there. When Mr. Cromes agreed to talk to me, I was ecstatic. He'd worked at Stragview during the 80s, a time when physical violence was still in full swing, no pun intended. Grandpa and Cromes had started at the same time, and the two were friends and had been work partners. Grandpa had also been an observer to the incident that Mr. Cromes was going to tell me about. The other officers are calling it the lightning killings, and they had a lot of people freaked out. Several guards quit during that period, and many of us kept an eye out over our shoulder, fearing we were next. The lightning killings had claimed the lives of multiple inmates, and landed one guard in the hospital, Granddad confided. He also claimed that they were committed by a single inmate, an inmate who was in the infirmary at the time of the killings. An old Ford pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, and a tall man with silver hair climbed out. He was dressed modestly, blue jeans and a button-down shirt, and he made eye contact with me before ambling into the restaurant. He ordered some food before coming to my table with his tray and fixing me with a speculative look. "You Fred's grandkid?" "I am. So you're writing a book about Stragview, that right?" "Yeah, I'm hoping you can tell me something about the lightning killings." He smirked as he sat down, but there was no mirth in it. "Told you about that, huh? You realize the warden will never let your book come out. He was the warden of Stragview for 30 years that I worked there, and he's quite the powerful figure in the community." "I've been told he's been a powerful figure for longer than that." He took a sip of his coffee. "Can't speak to that, but I can speak to the lightning killings. I was a witness to the whole damn thing. If you've got the time, I guess I'll tell you." I took out a tape recorder and set it between us, depressing the record button as I waited for him to start. He was willing, it seemed, though I didn't understand then what this story would cost me. "Stragview is a strange place, but I think you know that already. I've seen beautiful things inside those walls, and I've seen monstrous acts committed by both officers and inmates alike. When you're inside those walls, you feel like you've stepped out of time, out of space, and you don't really realize it until you're lying in your bed, thinking about the day you've just had. From September till mid-October of 1985, I was stuck in one of those miasmas of weirdness. It all started with the power outage on the morning of September 6th. We were in the middle of a heat wave, the hottest it had been in September in living memory. The power had suddenly decided to go out on top of everything. The loss of electricity meant no fans, no radios at night, and the failure of the freezers in the kitchen. The food there had spoiled, and the inmates were not pleased. The day before the incident on the rec yard had been Chicken Day, a day usually held in high expectation. But with the freezers down, the inmates had been close to rioting. The heat hadn't helped matters, and we officers were sweltering in our uniforms as we tried to keep the peace. However, a few of them had taken it as an opportunity to take revenge. September 7th was the day of the rec yard fight that landed inmate Frazier in the infirmary and kicked this whole thing off. I had lost a game of rock, paper, scissors to your granddad, and, as such, had to work the rec yard in the sweltering heat. So I was standing on the rec yard on what felt like the hottest day of the year when the whole thing broke loose. This was only a Stragview thing, by the way. Once you got back to town, the temperature was an average of 70 degrees, pretty standard for the season. However, the closer you got to Stragview, the hotter it seemed to get. We were never sure why, but I was quickly sweating through my uniform when Sergeant Caden and a few of the other officers walked up. Caden was a real asshole, a grade A jerk who liked to cause trouble. I was never scared of a fight, your granddad either, but we never went looking for trouble. Caden, on the other hand, lived to lay hands on inmates. He was a big guy, discharged from the Marines before coming to work at prison, and he was known for taking inmates out of view and beating the tar out of them. Didn't matter who they were. If they got in his way or got on his bad side, they were going to get beat up. All of them, besides inmate Frazier. Frazier had sucker punched him during one of those disciplinary meetings he held and dropped him in one shot. More importantly, he'd embarrassed him in front of a bunch of his friends, and that was his biggest mistake. Caden still had a bruise on his cheek where he'd hit the pavement, and I could tell that he was coming to cause trouble on my yard. There were a lot of inmates out on the grass, playing baseball, running, just using the equipment to exercise, and I could see Frazier talking with some guys by the baseball field. I begged Caden not to when it came up. "Not today, Caden. It's too damn hot for this crap today." Caden smirked. "I just want to talk with him, that's all." The fact that he already had his hand on his baton told me all I needed to know. He and his cronies were pushing past me as they made their way over to Frazier. Frazier had his back to him, but when his friends saw the group heading their way, they moved off quickly. No one wanted to get on Caden's bad side, and they knew that Frazier was about to come in for a beating, at the very least. He turned around, clearly expecting some retaliation after besting Caden a few days before. Caden had been off the last 2 days, leaving him with plenty of time to seethe, and it appeared that he was ready to make good on all that downtime. I watched as they began talking, Frazier smiling and trying to back himself out of the situation, as Caden edged closer and looped the rawhide thong of his baton around his hand. They started out well enough, but eventually Frazier had enough of Caden's sass and started giving it back. Caden didn't seem to like this, especially when Frazier's back talk started making the other guards laugh. I could see his face darkening as Frazier continued to talk, oblivious of the danger he was putting himself in. When Caden punched him in the mouth, I started moving towards the two at a run. When Caden raised that club of his for the initial strike, Frazier reeled back from one of his punches, and I caught the end and told him that was enough. He smiled over his shoulder, before he elbowed me in the ribs and brought the baton across my face. I was unconscious before I hit the ground. Frazier was not so lucky. I looked up, pen scritching over my notebook as the old guard finished his memory and took a long sip of his coffee. Are you saying you were assaulted by a fellow staff member while trying to break up abuse? Mr. Crome shrugged. I'm saying that things like that happened a lot back then. Officers beat inmates. It happened. Sometimes I agreed with it. Sometimes I didn't. This time I didn't, and I tried to put a stop to it. So that was the start of the murders. Inmate Frazier's death was the "Who said Frazier died of his injuries? You young people, always so quick to get to the kill that you can't enjoy a good story anymore. Do you want to hear it or not?" I nodded, urging him to continue. I woke up in the infirmary with a lump on my head and a throbbing headache. The nurse told me to take it easy, but she needn't have worried. My head was hurting too bad to get up to too much right then. They let me go home early, and I made a mental note to talk to Caden about his little head cracking when I came back to work next. I had the day off, thanks to my injury, which was good, because it turned out I had a slight concussion and spent the night throwing up in my bathroom. That was the first night of storms and the first night of killings. The phone rang about 6:30 the next morning, and I only know this because I looked at the wall clock as I staggered out of the bathroom. Your grandfather was calling to tell me about what had happened that night. Back then, we did revolving shifts, so no one got stuck on nights all the time, and I would be starting my first night of midnights that night. Our whole shift had been transitioned to nights for 3 months, and what a start of festivities it was. He had worked the night before, and he told me how all hell had broke loose that night. It was crazy. The lightning started early, big angry forks and pelting rain that came down in buckets, and just about the time it seemed to hover over the compound, we got the call from Bravo Dorm. We had a trainee in there, a kid named Dockett, and he gets on the radio and starts calling for help. 10 codes be damned. The captain asked what the situation was, and he says he's got a fight going on. The kid sounds scared, half out of his mind. The 4 of us who were hanging around the captain's office go pelting through the rain towards the dorm, figuring we'll find a couple of inmates in the bathroom swinging on each other. We arrived to find one guy on his back, eyes staring at the ceiling, dead as a post. Dockett was in the station stammering about how the lights kept flickering, and he'd seen the inmates fighting. He wouldn't say much more, but he looked pretty shaken up. We called medical and got Dockett and the stiff down there, but we couldn't find anyone else with wounds on him. Dockett gave us a description of the other guy. Medical took the body, and we headed back to our respective dorms to fill out paperwork. I told him it sounded like a pretty crazy night, but he just laughed. You hadn't heard the worst of it. I was halfway back to Foxtrot when the officer I left in there starts yelling about a fight in our dorm. We lock the cell doors at 9, and our cleaning guys are done by 11. It's midnight. There shouldn't be anyone in the quad to fight. So I go running back to the dorm, and I come in the side door looking through the glass that separates the quads from the halls. I see 2 inmates, one on the ground and one on top of the other. The one on top is beating the holy hell out of the guy on the ground, and the guy on the ground is convulsing like an electric current is going through him with every hit. I bang on the glass, yelling at them to separate, and the guy on top looks back at me with a look of the most abject hatred I have ever seen. The rest of the team bursts in then, and when I turned back, the guy was gone. I asked what he meant, not sure how someone just disappears from a secure quad like that. I mean, he was there one minute and gone the next. The other inmate was twitching, his breath coming out all weird and gaspy, and Hancock starts giving him CPR like they taught us to do. The rest of us start looking for the other inmate, but I knew we weren't going to find him. I asked how he knew, and he suddenly sounded very nervous, because it was Frazier. The inmate in F dorm was Gusper, the one he'd gotten into a fight with last month over unpaid debts. That's not all. The inmate in B dorm was Kellogg, the inmate who beat him up a few months ago to join the white boys. By the time the sun came up, both of them were dead, and no one really believed what I'd seen. Why not? I asked. Frazier sleeps in F dorm. He could very well have killed Gusper but your granddad cut me off. Frazier's still in the infirmary, Mickey. He's unconscious. Hasn't come out since he jumped Caden on the rec yard. I tried not to scoff at the story Caden was passing around, but your granddad had a weird tale nonetheless. Just how weird, I wouldn't know till that night. I leaned forward, recorder still running, as the old man stared at me over his steepled fingers. What happened that night? It's getting on a bit, kid. You mind if we pick this up another time? He said it casually enough, but I couldn't help but notice that he kept glancing at someone standing at the counter. Someone in a jacket with a DOC patch on it. I agreed to meet him a few days later for breakfast at a little diner downtown, and he left in a hurry after saying he'd see me then. I researched the two inmates he mentioned. They were indeed reported dead in 1985 while incarcerated at Stragview. The cause of death was heart attack, and it seemed they were not the only instances of sudden cardiac arrest in September. In all, 15 people died of sudden cardiac arrest in September and October. Most of them were inmates, but I noticed that 4 were officers. Something had happened at Stragview that month, and the fact that it hadn't made the papers was a miracle. Whatever these killings were, they were exactly what I was looking for. The diner was packed. Mr. Crome was waiting in a back booth when I arrived, and waved me over as I came in. I'd spent the last few weeks researching the prison, the same thing I'd been doing for the previous year, but now it was more of an eye towards strange occurrences. Stragview had its share of unnatural deaths and odd disappearances, but the prison seemed to be good at covering them up. I'd been excited to talk with Cromes again, and his story had made me reach out to some of the others I'd been hesitant to talk to. There was a real story here. I just had to put it together. I'd wanted to speak to Cromes again, but it had been almost 2 weeks since I'd managed to get in touch with him. He sounded nervous when he spoke to me, unsure about our next meeting, but sure that it had to happen. Crome had something to say, and he wouldn't be bullied out of saying it. Mr. Crome had set himself near the back wall, the front door in full view. The place was full enough that we would be hard to eavesdrop on, and harder still to pick out of a crowd. The waitress ambled over, and I ordered some food. Mr. Cromes waved me off when I offered to pay for his meal, just holding out his coffee cup for the waitress to refill. He took a sip before turning back to me, savoring the dark liquid. "So, I see I didn't scare you off. Seems like you might have been the one that got spooked. Did you worry you were being tailed?" Mr. Crome looked uncomfortable as he sipped his coffee. His eyes flitted around the diner, and I could tell he was looking for familiar faces. He must have been satisfied with what he saw, because he turned back and pitched his voice low. "I told you about the warden's influence, right? Let's just say that I've seen some things that could get me in a lot of trouble if I went blabbing about them." "Then why talk to me at all?" I asked, very curious about why he would stick his neck out. "Because maybe I need to be in trouble. Maybe it's time we paid for what we did that night in October. I spent the next 25 years trying to make amends for that night, but it never seemed like enough. No matter where I went or what I did, I couldn't shake Fraser's face. We did him a disservice, and it's time people knew about it. It's time they knew a lot of things. Some skeletons are hidden under Stragview that need to come out, and some aren't even skeletons yet. Still want to hear about it?" When I set the tape recorder between us and clicked it on, he grinned, showing me yellow teeth that had seen a lot of coffee and cigarettes in their day. "Good." A week later, I saw Fraser with my own eyes. We had a full shift that night. No call-outs, no vacations, so every dorm had 2 people in it. I usually worked with your grandfather, but the captain had put me in a dorm with Sergeant Caden. I was told later that he had gotten a complaint from the officer he'd put in there the night before. Cap needed someone in there that he was unlikely to sexually harass, and I was elected. I started the paperwork, counted, made small talk, and generally tried to ride out the night. Caden had apologized for what he'd done on the yard by then. He claimed he got a little out of hand and didn't mean to stick me. I had generously accepted it, hinting that the info might be something I'd want to hang on to for later. We had a tentative truce since then, and as the thunder rumbled away in the woods, we settled in for a long, boring night. When the rain started, the lights flickered in the cages above the beds, and the tin roof sounded like there might be a little hail in it. We hadn't had a good storm since a week before, and I remembered wondering if it was going to be as crazy as the one your granddad had told me about. Round about the time the lightning started, the lights went out completely. That was 9, and we sat there with just the emergency lights for company for an hour before the incident took place. Caden was just finishing telling me a story that was 90% bullshit when someone started screaming on the floor. We shined our lights into the dorm, flashing them through the cage bars that surrounded us, and we could both see someone pinned against the wall. He was looking at whoever's back was to us and shuddering all over. The person menacing him was yelling incoherently, and when the lightning peeled overhead, you could see that whoever the other wasn't quite right. His proportions were wrong, too big, too undefined, and he seemed to move beneath his clothes like a bundle of wires. My daddy had a scarecrow made of old spun-together coat hangers when I was a kid. This fella looked like he had, his clothes vaguely man-shaped, but not in one solid piece. Caden sprang into action, grabbing his stick and telling me to hang tight. He lumbered onto the floor, shouting at the 2 to separate. The inmate who was pinned jerked a little as the other reached for him, and I could swear I could see sparks coming off his skin. He reached out a hand to take the man by the throat, and when he did, he started bucking like someone who's grabbed an electric fence. Caden roared as he came in, bringing his stupid club down on the other. It pulled lamely at the shirt, and I could see that whatever lay beneath was more liquid than solid. When the other turned his face and bellowed at Caden, that was when I saw him. Inmate Fraser's face was lumpy and damaged, his eyes black pits of red rage, and Caden took a step back as it turned and fixed him with its gaze. The club fell with a hollow wooden clump, and Caden began to run as the thing turned away from its target and came after him instead. The inmate that had been pinned, Griggs, his name had been Griggs, crumpled down the wall, still convulsing as he fell. Caden was out the door as the Fraser thing walked jerkily across the floor, and that was when it saw me. His eyes met mine, and I could see nothing but hate, nothing but fear, nothing but uncertainty behind them. He approached me, eyes locked on mine through the glass of the booth, and I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. People were yelling at him to sit down before the other guards got here, but he ignored them and just kept coming closer and closer to my office. I backed away, trying to put distance between us, but I hit the opposite wall as he came right up to the glass. I could see his deep blue eyes pulsating with deeper energy as he tried to press his face through the wire mesh and glass and right into the station. I tried to push my backside out the other side and into the adjacent sleeping area, but it remained substantial against me. When he hit the glass with his head, cracking it and causing it to ripple like splintered ice, I yelled loud enough to wake the dead. The A-team arrived a few minutes later, and when they did, Fraser was gone. He left nothing but a pile of clothes and the splintered glass in his wake. Gone? Where did he go? Chrome shrugged. Vanished, just like he had in Foxtrot. If I hadn't seen him for myself, I would have never believed it. When I talked to your grandfather about it, he seemed unsure about what he had seen that night, after having some time to think about it. I asked him if he'd seen Fraser too, but now he didn't seem to want to talk about it. He was scared, but the fear for us had just begun. Caden may have escaped the dorm while Fraser was staring at me, but his luck wouldn't last forever. The waitress brought out food then, bacon, eggs, hash browns, and toast, and refilled Chrome's coffee again. He let me pick at the food a little before he asked if I wanted him to continue. I was hooked by this point, enraptured by the story, and the idea of someone having their revenge from their infirmary bed. I nodded, the recorder still running, and he picked back up again. A week later, things had settled down a little. Caden had taken 2 nights off, leaving early that night after he'd run straight to the captain's office to tell him about the fight. He had used those 2 days to convince himself that it was all crap and that no boogeyman Fraser was out to get him. He'd seen something, yes, but it was a trick of the light. Besides, Griggs hadn't even died that night. He'd spent a couple of days in the infirmary with light burns on his chest and neck, but he'd made a full recovery. As the muggy weather stretched on and the sky stayed cloudless, we all prepared for an unreasonably warm autumn. Then the storms came back, and it was a bloodbath. It came up suddenly one night, the first peal of thunder seeming to attract the buckets of rain that followed, and the killings weren't far behind. It happened suddenly and without warning. 4 inmates from 4 different dorms, as the worst storm of the year raged out of control. The traffic was always the same: 2 inmates fighting, or inmates kicking the door saying someone was fighting. We had to run between Hotel and Echo to Alpha, and then back to Hotel, though it was a different quad. All 4 seemed to have died of a heart attack, their hearts having just stopped beating all of a sudden. They were all deemed as such, but they were seen fighting with other inmates before they died in 2 cases. We would get to the dorm and find the body lying by their bed or crumpled over in the bathroom with no other combatant in sight. The 2 from hotel died in their cells, but both cellmates swore they'd seen someone in the cell after lockdown fighting with the victim. That someone couldn't be found, and by the end of the night, we were soaked to the skin and ready to chew nails. Cap was filling out paperwork, trying not to let his fear show. We left that night, the rain showing no signs of stopping. Luckily, however, the lightning took a break, and we had a week of balmy, rainy weather. Made us all wish the heat had been our only concern. I remember my boots being constantly wet for that week, and the general feeling of unease as the idea of another string of heart attacks hung over the compound. A week later, the first week of October, the rain retook a thundery tone, and 2 inmates died of heart attacks. One of them, a guy named Drell, had been walking to an early morning call-out when he was suddenly set upon by an unknown person. McLemore, the officer who'd been escorting him, said they had just been rounding the side of Charlie dorm when someone had come out of the shadows and shoved McLemore over and jumped on Drell. Drell had screamed like a pig who's got his leg hung, but as McLemore grabbed for his radio, it was already too late. Drell's body was still twitching, but his life had fled. McLemore said the guy had been enormous, 6 feet at least, but no one was ever found, and no one besides Drell was on the yard at the time. The week after, 2 more were found dead in their beds after the lights came on, both with burn wounds around their throats. That was when my fellow officers started leaving. Most of them were just smart enough to see the writing on the wall, and they weren't about to get caught up in this bullcrap. It was only a matter of time before someone got blamed or an officer got caught up in this nonsense. Caden had already started whispering about what he'd seen, and some of his friends were not real big on getting caught in the crossfire if Frazier came for them. Others were just lazy and simply looking for an excuse to burn vacation or sick leave. All of them were gutless, and it left the shift ragged and undermanned. That was how I came to be in the captain's office, helping with paperwork. You see, inmates will always take an opportunity when handed to them. They had picked up on these mysterious killers and decided to run with it. On top of the 10 killings committed by our mystery man, we'd had 6 stabbings, 5 assault, and found a dozen or so new weapons during a dorm raid. Our captain was beside himself, worrying that his job was history, and we were ragged from running in the rain, which had been falling almost constantly since September had become October. I was sitting with the inmate files and going over them before sending them to the warden. I started comparing them to the 2 inmates that were killed the first night. 6 of them had disciplinary notes in their files from the last 6 months, and most of them had cited inmate Frazier as the victim. 4 had been sent to confinement for fighting or stealing. 2 more had been written up for alleged gang activities. I imagined that the others would have some sort of run-in with Frazier as well, though they'd been smart enough to keep it under the radar. I felt myself shudder under my wet uniform, remembering what I'd seen, and thought of Frazier finding a way to tie up loose ends from his infirmary bed. As I made a note on my soggy notebook, I could hear the captain making excuses to the warden on the phone. 10 deaths, multiple injuries, and a lot of man-hours used to quell them. I imagined he was up to his ass in alligators over this, and it wouldn't take much for them to have his bars over it, his fault or not. when the radio crackled and the scared voice of trainee Freck came blaring over it. I thought this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. "I need help. Please help me. Officer down. Repeat. Officer down in Delta Dorm, side 2. I need help. Please, someone help me." We were running before we knew what we were doing. Officer down was one of those phrases that elicits immediate action if you're any kind of officer. Doesn't matter if you like the guy who's getting his ass beat or not. You go and help, 'cause you'd want him to run if it was you in trouble. I met your grandfather as we both ran across the grass, slipping and sliding in the mud as we tried to stay upright. We burst through the doors to side 2 together, batons in hand and ready for anything. That's when I saw a familiar face slumped over a sink. He was still twitching, his eyes still jittering and dancing in his skull as he convulsed. And I noticed a pair of discarded blues sitting on the floor by his feet. He was pale, his hands gripping his chest as he looked at us like he thought we could throw him a raft in these troubled waters. He was one of the officers who had gone to the rec yard with Caden. Officer Miles was receiving his comeuppance for his hand in Frazier's beating, but I wasn't going to let one of my own get caught up in an inmate's revenge fantasy. Your grandfather and I were on him in a second. He was still breathing, but his heart was fluttering in his chest like a caged bird. We carried him between us, the rain sheeting down as we drug him to medical. Miles was twitching like a landed trout, and his feet kept kicking the ground like he was trying to trip us. We nearly dropped him a few times, and as we came by the captain's office, a few others came out to help us. They had been grouping up to go to Delta Dorm, and now that they saw what was waiting for them, they came out to help us drag him to medical. We were all completely soaked by the time we got there, and Miles had stopped gasping and started wheezing. The nurses took him from us and wheeled him to the back, giving him something to get his heart back on track and calling the hospital to get a bed ready for him. We left him in their capable hands, but I couldn't help but look through the glass to Frazier in his infirmary bed. His head was bandaged, his eyes blackened, and he was staring at the ceiling as he lay there. His face, however, wore the most cherubic grin I'd ever seen on a grown man. It was hard to believe a man who smiled like that could have been doing what he was doing. I went down to Delta Dorm after that to ask Freck what he'd seen. To say the kid was shaken would have been an understatement. I found him sitting in one of the big uncomfortable metal chairs we kept in the office, knees to his chest as he breathed like he was having a panic attack. He jumped when I touched his shoulder, not even hearing me come in. The sight of someone like me, a real officer, seemed to calm him. I took a seat across from him and, much as you're doing here, started making mental notes for later. He told me that Miles had been attacked by an inmate that had melted into clothes once he was done. He was out doing a walkthrough, making sure everyone was asleep, and he was coming back through the bathroom to get back to the station when something stepped out of a toilet stall and grabbed him. He grabbed him by the shoulders, and his hands kind of glowed. I don't know. I was beating on the glass and yelling at him to stop. Miles started convulsing and twitching like he was being electrocuted. That's when I started yelling over the radio, telling people to come help. He pushed him against the sink, Miles jittered and shaking, and then you and Officer Grimes came bursting in, and he just melted. The kid looked pretty rattled, and I took his post and let him go home. Freck went on to become a major, a freaking major, but I always remembered him as that scared-as-shit TA who nearly pissed his pants in Delta Dorm. Just goes to show you. He finished another coffee, and I began to smell lunch cooking from the kitchen. Was it lunchtime already? It had just been morning time. How long had I been sitting here, listening to this man tell me about a particular stretch of 1985? My phone vibrated in my pocket, freeing me from my trance, and I pulled it out to check my messages. My stomach dropped, and I was out of the booth in a second. I gotta go. Chrome looked worried. Everything okay? My mom's at the hospital with my grandpa. Somebody tried to run him off the road. Granddad was in the ICU when I arrived. I found my parents and my grandmother sitting in the waiting room. Mom hugged me when she saw me, her tears making my shoulders soggy all at once. They wouldn't let her see him yet, Granddad having just gotten out of surgery, but the police were hoping to ask him some questions when he came to. I asked what had happened to him, and Mom said the officer she'd talked to hadn't had a lot of information. Someone had run his car off the road while he was driving to Walmart and slammed him into a tree. The other car hadn't been at the scene, but they had left Granddad there when they pulled off. Another driver had seen the wreck and called an ambulance. I sat in the waiting room with my parents, and I couldn't help but wonder if this had anything to do with my prying. Granddad had put me in touch with Mr. Cromes, a retired officer who'd warned me about the far-stretching influence of the warden. Hadn't Cromes acted scared when he'd seen a fellow officer at McDonald's that day? Surely no one had done this to my grandfather, a man in his 60s, to send a message to me. No one was that vindictive to hit and run one of their own, right? The doctor came out as I was mulling it over to give us a breakdown. Grandpa was awake, but the painkillers they had him on were making him loopy. He had a broken leg, a fractured arm, and his collarbone had been mended with a couple of big metal screws. He'd lost a lot of blood, but they were hopeful that he'd recover. He suggested that we come back tomorrow, since they'd try to step him down to a regular room if he did well tonight. We left, not really sure what to expect, but hopeful. I didn't hear from Cromes for 2 weeks. When I did, he called to tell me that he would meet me at a bar in the next town. He sounded tired, and I wanted to ask if something had happened. He didn't stay on the phone long, though. He gave me the address and hung up, leaving me in the lurch until 2 days later, when the appointed time arrived. That time would prove harder to nail down than he thought. He told me it'd be 2 more weeks instead of 1. When he missed that meeting too, he called the next day to say that he'd meet me next week at the same spot. I met a lot of people in that time. They were ex-inmates, officers both current and retired, all with a story to tell about that strange old place. None of them wanted their names used. None of them wanted anything the warden could track them with. And all of them seemed to be heading somewhere else. Some of them came in person. Most just sent letters. But they all told a tale of that strange old prison. I was actually just compiling another story when Cromes called to tell me the time was moving up. "Meet me this afternoon at noon, and don't be late. I can't stay long." The bar was a dive, a dingy little roadside spot with pickup trucks in the parking lot at noon and a greasy look that persisted after sunrise. The inside was a gaggle of day drinkers, a harassed-looking bartender in biker leathers, and Cromes. He was sitting near the bathroom, much as he had at the diner. He was sipping whiskey from a cracked mug and waved me over when he saw me come in. He was dressed in a long coat despite the heat and had sunglasses and a cap on to obscure his face. Even so, he looked rough. His facial hair was scraggly and several days old. He seemed tired as he sagged against the booth. Despite this, he looked relieved that I had arrived. "This has probably got to be our last meeting, kid. I've been dodging them for the last few weeks, but they definitely know that I'm talking to someone about old times. They definitely know you have too, and I'd wager some of those people you've spoken with wish they'd never heard of you. Regardless, I'm on my way out of town. If you want the rest of the story, you better hurry." "Are these the same guys who hurt my granddad?" "Probably. You better watch yourself. It's only a matter of time before you learn too much." "I'll take my chances," I said, clicking on the tape recorder and taking out my notepad. Cromes nodded. "Very well. The last night. The night we handled the problem and sealed our fates." We were all summoned to the warden's office before we left that morning. We were cold, sore, and ready to collapse. But when the warden calls, you go. Your granddad and I were there, along with Caden, our captain, and 2 other officers that helped on the yard sometimes, Merrick and Holmes. He was sitting behind his desk, close-cut gray hair and immaculate pinstripe suit, as he sipped tea and took us in. I worked under him my whole career. All of us did, and he never got any easier to be around. The man wasn't like us. The man was downright spooky. You may be interested to know that Officer Miles is in stable condition at Emory, thanks to your efforts last night. On the other hand, I've had 4 officers quit on the way out today, and I expect there will be more before shift begins tonight. Something must be done about this, something that none of you are going to like." He looked at Caden as he said it, knowing that it was a lie, but going on anyway. I was content to study this phenomenon when it was merely inmates, but now that Frazier is affecting my staff, this little experiment has to stop. The captain had looked skeptical, looking at Caden before saying, "Sir, inmate Frazier has been in infirmary for several weeks now. I've been told he's in a—" "Martin, when I want information, I'll read your incident reports. I have the training staff bringing our next crop of TAs over tonight for some on-the-job training. You 6 will be transporting an inmate tonight. If you call out, I will send people to your home to collect you. This is not a request. This is one of those special circumstances laid out in your contract. You will speak of this to no one. What we do tonight will have never happened. When we transport this inmate, he will cease to be an issue for this compound, and you would all do well to purge him from your memories. Do I make myself clear?" We all said he had, and he instructed us to meet him in medical at 11 o'clock. Until then, we were dismissed. I don't think any of us slept very well that day, but all of us arrived on time, petering out our nights until 11 o'clock arrived. I looked up from my paperwork at 10:30 and started making excuses to the officer working with me that evening. His name was Fozzie, and he was greener than summer grass. He'd go on to be one of the best captains we ever had, but right then he was a 20-year-old who was scared and did not want to be left in a dorm by himself. I considered trying to use him as an excuse, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. In the end, I told him I'd be back soon and made my exit. The thunder was already rumbling off in the distance as I made my way to medical. The weather report hadn't said anything about rain tonight, but I guess the local news was mostly just guessing, as usual. It would be the last rain we had until January, plunging the region into a drought that nearly doomed the autumn crop. For that week, though, we had called down the thunder and the rain every night, and we were forced to deal with it. Right up until we were forced to deal with Frazier. They had loaded him into a wheelchair, and I saw the warden looking at the sky uncomfortably. I was told the rain would be over by now, but it appears that our window is not as wide as I had thought. Let's get this over with. We'll only have a small chance to make this work. We took him down the road towards J-Dorm. J-Dorm, in those days, was called the Death House. It was death row, Stragview having an active row to this day. In those days, we still use the electric chair. I know a lot of places have stopped using it now, but I remember Stragview using it right up until 2008, and only then because of an incident that has nothing to do with this story. We rolled him down the center road, past the tower, past the other dorms. Luckily, no one saw us as we went. The windows dark, and everyone who wasn't clocked in was asleep. The thunder drew closer, the smell of rain filling our nostrils. The captain rolled him along, the 6 of us flanking him like an honor guard. Frazier sat strapped in his chair, understanding none of this, while the men who put him in this state moved silently beside him. His head was covered in bandages, red with old blood, and his face was purple and slack. Someone had dressed him, but I'm sure there was bandages beneath his uniform, too. We were about to do something monstrous, no matter what Frazier had done, and it haunts me even now. We rolled him to the place that would become a killing field for many of us. The thunder rumbled off the walls of J-Dorm as we rolled inside. The concrete walls were sweating as much as the dorm sergeant, Sergeant Castor. He was watching the dorm on his own, death row currently empty, and he seemed unhappy about what sort of hell we were wheeling through his door. He and the warden had a heated discussion in his office, which ultimately led to nothing. In Stragview, the warden got his way. Period. "Take him to the showroom," the warden said, Castor hovering behind him like a worried hummingbird. Caden started to roll the chair, but I stood my ground, and your grandfather seemed very unsure about what we were about to do. I was under the impression we were taking him to a cell. Are we executing inmate Frazier, sir?" "We are," the warden said, gauging my response. "Sir, that's a capital offense. You're talking about murder." "Son, inside Stragview, I am judge, jury, and executioner. This man has already been expunged from the records. His death was reported a few days ago, and no one will question his disappearance. He is guilty of the murder of multiple inmates and the attempted murder of a staff member. If, however, you feel unable to fulfill your duties," he said, his eyes twinkling behind his little gold glasses, "we can add another murder to Frazier's charges." I felt a cold shudder run through me as I realized he was serious. I wanted to deny him, wanted to hang on to my pride, but I found my hands wrapped around the push handles as I prepared to guide him to his death. We rolled him past the cells, boxes lined with bars, through the adjoining hallway, and into the long room that held a vengeful god in steel and wool. The chair sat on a raised platform, oiled and gleaming, as its source of power made the walls shake. We brought him to the edge of the platform, and I could swear that he leaned his head back to look at it. I could have also sworn that his arms had a slight crackle across them as he sat before the chair. "Get him in quickly," the warden said. "The storm will be on us in minutes." We all moved to lift him out of the chair, but the warden slapped at my arm as he pushed me towards the little booth near the wall that held the switch. "Get in position. We only get one shot at this." They strapped him in, connecting the cap and securing the restraints. I saw no one bothering with the hood. Frazier lolled there in his bindings, dead to the world, and I put my hands on the lever as I waited for my signal. My misgivings were tucked away, someplace I could analyze them later. As everyone backed away, the warden pointed at me to make ready. We all waited for the hands to come down. It seemed like Frazier sat there for hours before the warden gave the signal, and I thrust down on the metal bar that would send the electricity out to end his life. As it came down, I heard a hum for half a second before the power went out completely. In the dark room, We could all feel the massive bolt of lightning that struck outside. We couldn't help but see the newcomer who had appeared amidst the group in the dark any more than we could have avoided feeling the rumble from that eldritch bolt as it hit. He was massive, 8 feet of seething rage, and his arms looked as big as trees. His roar sounded like thunder in a bottle as it coursed up his neon blue throat. He swung at them, scattering them as he screamed in anger, and those not knocked aside started running. It was too much. A giant that looked like forked lightning. I'm not ashamed to say that I cowered behind that protective screen, hoping to remain unseen, and those were the longest minutes of my life. I heard people being thrown around, heard the screams of men as they were beaten to death, and I heard that thing stomp as its weird light cast shadows on the wall. It was bigger than it had ever been, the storm and Frasia's rage giving it a strange light, and it used its newfound strength to hurt the men who had meant to kill Frasia. Something hit the other side of that blind, and I tucked my head down as it moaned and twitched. I reached a hand out timidly until I found a uniform shirt and drugged the man behind the screen with me. It was your granddad, and that was probably what saved him in the end. The doctor said he had a broken arm and some pretty severe burns when we got to medical. His injuries were nothing compared to the others, though. The thing beat them, broke them, and I could hear them as they died just beyond the partition. When the lights flickered, the generator started up at long last, and I heard a new sound from the throat of that behemoth. I heard that giant thing scream in pain as Frasia was electrocuted. The power surged through the chair, and I peeked up and over the lip of the little window to see what was happening. The giant and Frasia were both jerking, bodies whipping around madly as the current seemed to run through them both. The creature fell to his knees, its body still throbbing as the electricity seemed to arc through it like a spear. Then, all at once, it just burst apart. Its neon body erupted in a shower of sparks that set fire to some of the chairs and boxes stored around it. Its pieces lay amongst the broken bodies of the other officers I had come in with, and I began to wonder if your granddad and I were the only survivors of this little adventure. I pushed the switching lever back up as Frasia began to blacken, his hair starting to smoke, and as the current turned off with a sudden loud thunk, I left your grandfather to assess the situation. Caden was the only one who survived that night out of the group, other than me and your granddad. He'd been thrown into some chairs and knocked unconscious, his head sporting a long, bloody gash. It healed badly and left a disfiguring scar that he wore for the rest of his life. I always considered it a good punishment for being responsible for 14 people's deaths. The others, the captain, the 3 officers, and the J-Dorm sergeant were all dead. Their bodies were burnt, their skin burst and red from contact with the creature, and they looked like a cow I had once seen after it had been struck by lightning. I was helping your granddad to his feet when the warden appeared suddenly beside me. He was unharmed somehow, and despite being a little rumpled, he was none the worse for wear. He told me to take your granddad to medical and tell them that the lightning had struck the yard and killed some men. We were to say nothing of J-Dorm or the execution under threat of death, and we walked away feeling pretty lucky. I heard later that the going story was the lightning had struck our little group as we huddled on the yard. We'd been lucky. Caden had been lucky, but the others had died in a freak accident. No mention of Frasia was ever made again, and we got on with our lives. He seemed to come out of it, his eyes having been locked on his beer for the last hour, as he recounted his tale. They made Caden the new J-Dorm sergeant after that. I guess the warden figured he was loyal enough to keep his mouth shut, as long as they let him beat and fry the occasional inmate. He lasted about 5 years at it, before he took his own life. But that's a story I might share with you some other time, if I happen to survive these tumultuous few weeks. We talked a little more after that, him answering some of my questions and me trying not to pry too much. He left not long after that, and I never saw him again, though I did hear from him a few more times. His story inspired me to keep writing, to tell the stories that Stragview doesn't want me to tell. I will publish this book. I will unearth the skeletons that lay beneath the soil of Stragview. Even if this book becomes my headstone, I will tell these stories.